Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Sonder, Anne, Nancy, and Jean. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes and collections of episodes by topic, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight we kick off 2024 with another reading from a perennial favorite, the Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt for the use of students and travelers, by Gaston Camille Charles Maspero, DCL Oxford, member of the Institute of France, professor at the Collège de France, ex-director general of Egyptian Museums, translated by Amelia B. Edwards, in a new edition, revised and enlarged by the author, with 309 illustrations. First published in 1895. Let's pick up right where we left off in Chapter 3, Tombs. Let's begin. The Great Pyramid of Saqqara is not oriented with exactness. The north face is turned 4 degrees 21 minutes east of the true north. It is not a perfect square, but is elongated from east to west, the sides being 395 and 351 feet. It is 196 feet high and is formed of 6 great steps with inclined faces, each retreating about 7 feet. The step nearest the ground is 37.5 feet high, and the top one is 29 feet high, as shown in Figure 137. It is built entirely of limestone quarried from the neighboring hills. The blocks are small and badly cut, and the courses are concave according to a plan applied both to quays and to fortresses. On examining the breaches in the masonry, it is seen that the outer face of each step is coated with 2 layers, each of which has its regular casing. The mass is solid, the chambers being cut in the rock below the pyramid. It has 4 entrances, the main one being in the north, and the passages form a perfect labyrinth, which it is perilous to enter. Porticos with columns, galleries, and chambers all end in a kind of pit, in the bottom of which a hiding place was contrived, doubtless intended to contain the most precious objects of the funerary furniture. The pyramids which surround this extraordinary monument have been nearly all built on one plan, and only differ in their proportions. The door, Figure 138A, opens close below the first course, about the middle of the north face, and the passage B descends by a gentle slope between two walls of limestone. It is plugged up all along by large blocks, which needed to be broken up before the first chamber could be entered, C. Beyond this chamber it is carried for some way through the limestone rock. Then it passes between walls, ceiling, and floor of polished syenite, after which the limestone reappears and the passage opens into the vestibule, E. The part built of granite is interrupted thrice at intervals of 2 to 2.5 feet by 3 enormous portcullises of granite, D. Above each of these a hollow is left, in which the portcullis stone could be held up by props, and thus leave a free passage, figure 139. The mummy once placed inside, the workmen as they left removed the supports, and the portcullises fell into place, cutting off all communication with the outside. The vestibule was flanked on the east by a flat-roofed serdab, F, divided into 3 niches, and encumbered with chips of stone swept hastily in by the workmen when they cleared the chambers to receive the mummy. The Pyramid of Unis has all 3 niches preserved, but in the pyramids of Teti and of Merenra, the separating walls have been neatly cut away in ancient times, without leaving any trace but a line of attachment and a whiter color in the stone where it had been originally covered. The sarcophagus chamber G extends west of the vestibule. The sarcophagus was placed there along the west wall, feet to the south, head to the north. The roof over the 2 main chambers was pointed, figure 140. It was formed of large beams of limestone, joined at the upper ends and supported below upon a low bench, which surrounded the chamber outside. The first beams were covered by 2 others, and these by 2 more, and the 6 together thoroughly protected the vestibule of the vault. The pyramids of Giza belong to the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, and those of Abusir to the pharaohs of the 5th. The 5 pyramids of Saqqara, of which the plan is uniform, belong to Unis and to the first 4 kings of the 6th dynasty, Teti, Pepi I, Merenra, and Pepi II, and are contemporary with the mastabas with painted vaults which I have mentioned above. It is therefore no matter of surprise to find them inscribed and decorated. The ceilings are covered with stars to represent the night sky. The rest of the decoration is very simple. In the Pyramid of Unis, which is the most ornamented, the decoration occupies only the end wall of the sepulchral chamber. The part against the sarcophagus was lined with alabaster and engraved to represent great monumental doors, through which the deceased was supposed to enter his storerooms of provisions. The figures of men and of animals, the scenes of daily life, the details of the sacrifice, are not here represented. The passages and the vault in which the soul alone was free to wander needed no ornamentation except that which related to the life of the soul. The texts are of 2 kinds. One kind, of which there are the fewest, refer to the nourishment of the double, and are literal transcriptions of the formulae by which the priests ensured the transmission of each object to the other world. This was a last resource for him in case the real sacrifices should be discontinued, or the magic scenes upon the chapel walls be destroyed. The greater part of the inscriptions were of a different kind. They referred to the soul and were intended to preserve it from the dangers which awaited it in heaven and on earth. They revealed to it the sovereign incantations which protected it against the bites of serpents and venomous animals, the passwords which enabled it to enter into the company of the good gods, and the exorcisms which counteracted the influence of the evil gods. The destiny of the double was to continue to lead the shadow of its terrestrial life and fulfill it in the chapel. The destiny of the soul was to follow the sun across the sky, and it therefore needed the instructions which it read on the walls of the vault. It was by their virtue that the absorption of the dead into Osiris became complete, and that they enjoyed hereafter all the immunity of the divine state. Above in the chapel they were men, and acted as men. Here they were gods, and acted as gods. The enormous rectangular mass which the Arabs call Mastabat el-Farun, the seat of Pharaoh, figure 141, stands beside the pyramid of Pepi II. Some have thought it to be an unfinished pyramid, some a tomb surmounted by an obelisk. In reality, it is a pyramid which was left unfinished by its builder, King Ati of the 6th dynasty. Recent excavations have, on the other hand, shown that the brick pyramids of Dashur probably belonged to the 12th dynasty. The stone pyramids of that group, which may be older, furnish a curious variation from the usual type. One of these stone pyramids has the lower half inclined at 54 degrees 41 minutes, while the upper part changes sharply to 42 degrees 59 minutes. It might be called a mastaba, crowned by a gigantic attic. At Lisht, where the two pyramids now standing are of the same period, one of them being erected by Usertesen I, the structure is again changed. The sloping passage ends in a vertical shaft, at the bottom of which open chambers now filled by the infiltration of the Nile. The pyramids of Ilahun and Hawara, which contained the remains of Usertesen II and Amenemhet III, are of the same type as those at Lisht. Their rooms are now filled with water. The pyramid of Madum is empty, having been violated before the Ramessid age. It consists of 3 square towers with sides slightly sloping, placed in retreating stages one over the other, figure 142. The entrance is on the north, at about 53 feet above the sand. After 60 feet, the passage goes into the rock. At 174 feet, it runs level. At 40 feet farther, it stops and turns perpendicularly towards the surface, opening in the floor of a vault 21 feet higher, as shown in figure 143. A set of beams and ropes still in place above the opening show that the spoilers drew the sarcophagus out of the chamber in ancient times. Its small chapel, built against the eastern slope of the pyramid, with courtyard containing a low flat altar between 2 standing stelae nearly 14 feet high, was found intact. The walls of the chapel were uninscribed and bare, but the graffiti found there proved that the place was much visited during the times of the 18th dynasty by scribes who recorded their admiration of the beauty of the monument and believed that King Sneferu had raised it for himself and for his queen, Merisanku. The custom of building pyramids did not end with the 12th dynasty. There are later pyramids at Monfalut, at Hakkali to the south of Abydos, and at Mohammereya to the south of Esneh. Until the Roman period, the semi-barbarous sovereigns of Ethiopia held it as a point of honor to give the pyramidal form to their tombs. The oldest, those of Nuri, where the pharaohs of Napata sleep, recall by their style the pyramids of Saqqara. The latest, those of Meroe, present fresh characteristics. They are higher than they are wide and built of small blocks, and are sometimes decorated at the angles with rounded borderings. The east face has a false window surmounted by a cornice and is flanked by a chapel which is preceded by a pylon. These pyramids are not all dumb. As in ordinary tombs, the walls contain scenes borrowed from the ritual of burial or showing the vicissitudes of the life beyond the grave. 3. The tombs of the Theban Empire. Excavated tombs. Two subsequent systems replaced the mastaba throughout Egypt. The first preserved the chapel constructed above ground and combined the pyramid with the mastaba. The second excavated the whole tomb in the rock, including the chapel. The necropolis quarter of Abydos, in which were interred the earlier generations of the Theban Empire, furnishes the most ancient examples of the first system. The tombs are built of large, black, unbaked bricks, made without any mixture of straw or grit. The lower part is a mastaba with a square or oblong rectangular base, the greatest length of the latter being sometimes 40 or 50 feet. The walls are perpendicular and are seldom high enough for a man to stand upright inside the tomb. On this kind of pedestal was erected a pointed pyramid of from 12 to 30 feet in height, covered externally with a smooth coat of clay painted white. The defective nature of the rock below forbade the excavation of the sepulchral chamber. There was no resource, therefore, except to hide it in the brickwork. An oven-shaped chamber with corbel vault was constructed in the center, figure 144, but more frequently, the sepulchral chamber is found to be half above ground in the mastaba and half sunk in the foundations, the vaulted space above being left only to relieve the weight, figure 145. In many cases, there was no external chapel. The stela placed in the basement or set in the outer face, alone marking the place of offering. In other instances, a square vestibule was constructed in front of the tomb where the relations assembled, figure 146. Occasionally, a breast-high enclosure wall surrounded the monument and defined the boundaries of the ground belonging to the tomb. This mixed form was much employed in Theban cemeteries from the beginning of the Middle Empire. Many kings and nobles of the 11th dynasty were buried at Dra Abul Nega in tombs like those of Abydos, figure 147. The relative proportion of mastaba and pyramid became modified during the succeeding centuries. The mastaba, often a mere insignificant substructure, gradually returned to its original height, while the pyramid has gradually decreased and ended by being only an unimportant pyramidion, Figure 148. All the monuments of this type which ornamented the Theban necropolis during the Ramessid period have perished, but contemporary tomb paintings show many varieties. In the chapel of an Apis, which died during the reign of Amenhotep III, still remains to show that this fashion extended as far as Memphis. Of the Pyramidion, scarcely any traces remain, but the mastaba is intact. It is a square mass of limestone raised on a base and surmounted by an overhanging cornice. A flight of 5 steps leads up to the inner chamber, figure 149. The earliest examples of the second kind are those found at Giza, among the mastabas of the 4th dynasty, and these are neither large nor much ornamented. They begin to be carefully wrought about the time of the 6th dynasty, and in certain distant places, as at Bersha, Sheikh Said, Khazar es Said, Ashuan, and Negada. The rock-cut tomb did not, however, attain its full development until the times of the last Memphite kings and the early kings of the Theban line. In these rock-cut tombs we find all the various parts of the mastaba. The designer selected a prominent vein of limestone, high enough in the cliff to risk nothing from the gradual rising of the soil, and yet low enough for the funeral procession to reach it without difficulty. The feudal lords of Minia slept at Beni Hassan, those of Khmunu at Bersha, those of Siut and Elephantine at Siut, and in the cliff opposite Assuan. Sometimes, as at Siut, Bersha, and Thebes, the tombs are excavated at various levels. Sometimes, as at Beni Hassan, they follow the line of the stratum and are ranged in nearly horizontal terraces. A flight of steps, rudely constructed in rough-hewn stones, leads up from the plain to the entrance of the tomb. At Beni Hassan and Thebes, these steps are either destroyed or buried in sand, but recent excavations have brought to light a well-preserved example leading up to a tomb at Assuan. The funeral procession, having slowly scaled the cliffside, halted for a moment at the entrance to the chapel. The plan was not necessarily uniform throughout any one group of tombs. Several of the Beni Hassan tombs have porticos, the pillars, bases, and entablatures being all cut in the rock. Those of Ameni and Khnumhotep have porticos supported on 2 polygonal columns, figure 151. At Assuan, figure 152, the doorway forms a high and narrow recess cut in the rock wall, but is divided at about 1/3 of its height by a rectangular lintel, thus making a smaller doorway in the doorway itself. At Siut, the tomb of Hapazefa was entered by a true porch about 24 feet in height, with a vaulted roof elegantly sculptured and painted. More frequently, the side of the mountain was merely cut away, and the stone dressed over a more or less extent of surface, according to the intended dimensions of the tomb. This method ensured the twofold advantage of clearing a little platform closed in on 3 sides in front of the tomb, and also of forming an upright facade which could be decorated or left plain, according to the taste of the proprietor. The door, sunk in the middle of this facade, has sometimes no framework. Sometimes, however, it has 2 jambs and a lintel, all slightly projecting. The inscriptions, when any occur, are very simple, consisting of 1 or 2 horizontal lines above and one or two vertical lines down each side, with the addition perhaps of a sitting or standing figure. These inscriptions contain a prayer as well as the name, titles, and parentage of the deceased. The chapel generally consists of a single chamber, either square or oblong, with a flat or a slightly vaulted ceiling. Light is admitted only through the doorway. Sometimes a few pillars, left standing in the rock at the time of excavation, give this chamber the aspect of a little hypostyle hall. 4 such pillars decorate the chapels of Ameni and Khnum Hotep at Beni Hassan, figure 153. Other chapels there contain 6 or 8 and are very irregular in plan. One tomb, unfinished, was in the first instance a simple oblong hall, with a barrel roof and 6 columns. Later on it was enlarged on the right side, the new part forming a kind of flat-roofed portico, supported on 4 columns. To form a serdab in the solid rock was almost impossible, while on the other hand, movable statues, if left in a room accessible to all comers, would be exposed to theft or mutilation. The serdab, therefore, was transformed and combined with the stela of the ancient mastabas. The false door of the olden time became a niche cut in the end wall, almost always facing the entrance. Statues of the deceased and his wife, carved in the solid rock, were there enthroned. The walls were decorated with scenes of offerings, and the entire decoration of the tomb converged towards the niche, and that of the mastaba converged towards the stela. The series of tableaux is, on the whole, much the same as of old, though with certain noteworthy additions. The funeral procession and the scene where the deceased enters into possession of his tomb, both merely indicated in the mastaba, are displayed in full upon the walls of the Theban sepulchre. The mournful cortege is there, with the hired mourners, the troops of friends, the bearers of offerings, the boats for crossing the river, and the catafalque drawn by oxen. It arrives at the door of the tomb. The mummy, placed upright upon his feet, receives the farewell of his family, and the last ceremonies, which are to initiate him into the life beyond the grave, are duly represented, figure 155. The sacrifices with all the preliminary processes, as tillage, seed growing, harvesting, stock breeding, and the practice of various kinds of handicraft, are either sculptured or painted as before. Many details, however, which are absent from tombs of the earlier dynasties are here given, while others which are invariably met with in the neighborhood of the pyramids are lacking. 20 centuries work many changes in the usages of daily life, even in conservative Egypt. We look almost in vain for herds of gazelles upon the walls of the Theban tombs, for the reason that these animals in Ramessid times had ceased to be bred in a state of domestication. The horse, on the other hand, had been imported into the valley of the Nile, and is depicted pawing the ground where formerly the gazelle was seen cropping the pasturage. The trades are also more numerous and complicated. The workmen's tools are more elaborate. The actions of the deceased are more varied and personal. In former times, when first the rules of tomb decoration were formulated, the notion of future retribution either did not exist or was but dimly conceived. The deeds which he had done here on earth in no wise influenced the fate which awaited the man after death, whether good or bad. from the moment when the funeral rites were performed and the necessary prayers recited, he was rich and happy. In order to establish his identity, it was enough to record his name, his title, and his parentage. His past was taken for granted. But when once a belief in rewards and punishments to come had taken possession of men's minds, they bethought them of the advisability of giving to each dead man the benefit of his individual merits. To the official register of his social status, they now therefore added a brief biographical notice. At first, this consisted of only a few words, but towards the time of the 6th dynasty, as where Una recounts his public services under 4 kings, these few words developed into pages of contemporary history. With the beginning of the new empire, tableaux and inscriptions combined to immortalize the deeds of the owner of the tomb. Khnum-hotep of Beni Hassan records in full the origin and greatness of his ancestors. Keti displays upon his walls all the incidents of a military life, parades, war dances, sieges, and sanguinary battle scenes. In this respect, as in all others, the 18th dynasty perpetuated the tradition of preceding ages, i.e., in his fine tomb at Tel El Amarna, recounts the episode of his marriage with the daughter of Khuanaten, Neferhotep of Thebes, having received from Horemheb the decoration of the golden collar, complacently reproduces every little incident of his investiture, the words spoken by the king, as also the year and the day when this crowning reward was conferred upon him. Another, having conducted a survey, is seen attended by his subordinates with their measuring chains. Elsewhere he superintends a census of the population, just as T formerly superintended the numbering of his cattle. The stela partakes of these new characteristics in wall decoration. In addition to the usual prayers, it now proclaims the praises of the deceased and gives a summary of his life. This is too seldom followed by a list of his honors with their dates. When space permitted, the vault was excavated immediately below the chapel. The shaft was sometimes sunk in a corner of one of the chambers, and sometimes outside, in front of the door of the tomb. In the great cemeteries, as for instance at Thebes and Memphis, the superposition of these 3 parts, the chapel, the shaft, and the vault, was not always possible. If the shaft were carried to its accustomed depth, there was sometimes the risk of breaking into tombs excavated at a lower level. This danger was met either by driving a long passage into the rock and then sinking the shaft at the farther end, or by substituting a slightly sloping or horizontal disposition of the parts for the old vertical arrangement of the mastaba model. The passage in this case opens from the center of the end wall, its average length being from 20 to 130 feet. The sepulchral vault is always small and plain, as well as the passage. Under the Theban dynasties, as under the Memphite kings, the soul dispensed with decorations. But whenever the walls of the vault are decorated, the figures and inscriptions are found to relate chiefly to the life of the soul, and very slightly to the life of the double. In the tomb of Horhotep, which is of the time of the Usertessens, and in similar rock-cut sepulchres, the walls, except on the side of the door, are divided into 2 registers. The upper row belongs to the double, and contains, besides the table of offerings, pictured representations of the same objects, which are seen in certain mastabas of the 6th dynasty, namely stuffs, jewels, arms, and perfumes, all needful to Horhotep for the purpose of imparting eternal youth to his limbs. The lower register belonged to both the soul and the double, and is inscribed with extracts from a variety of liturgical writings, such as the Book of the Dead, and Ritual of Embalmment, and the Funeral Ritual, all of which were possessed of magic properties, which protected the soul and supported the double. The stone sarcophagus, and even the coffin, are also covered with closely written inscriptions. Precisely as the stela epitomized the whole chapel, so did the sarcophagus and coffin epitomize the sepulchral chamber, thus forming, as it were, a vault within a vault. Texts, tableaux, all thereon depicted, treat of the life of the soul and of its salvation in the world to come. At Thebes, as at Memphis, the royal tombs are those which it is most necessary to study in order to estimate the high degree of perfection to which the decoration of passages and sepulchral chambers was now carried. The most ancient were situated either in the plain or on the southern slopes of the western mountain, and of these no remains are extant. The mummies of Amenhotep I and Thutmose III, of Sekenenra and Ahotep, have survived the dwellings of solid stone designed for their protection. Towards the middle of the 18th dynasty, however, all the best places were taken up, and some unoccupied site in which to establish a new royal cemetery had to be sought. At first they went to a considerable distance, namely to the end of the valley, known as the Western Valley, which opens from near Dra Abul Nega. Amenhotep III, Ai, and perhaps others were there buried. Somewhat later, they preferred to draw nearer to the city of the living. Behind the cliff which forms the northern boundary of the plain of Thebes, there lay a kind of rocky hollow, closed in on every side, and accessible from the outer world by only a few perilous paths. It divides into two branches which cross almost at right angles. One branch turns to the southeast, while the other, which again divides into secondary branches, turns to the southwest. Westward rises a mountain which recalls upon a gigantic scale the outline of the great step pyramid of Saqqara. The Egyptian engineers of the time observed that this hollow was separated from the ravine of Amenhotep III by a mere barrier some 500 cubits in thickness. In this there was nothing to dismay such practiced miners. They therefore cut a trench some 50 or 60 cubits deep through the solid rock, at the end of which a narrow passage opens like a gateway into the hidden valley beyond. Was it in the time of Horemheb, or during the reign of Ramses I, that this gigantic work was accomplished? Ramses I is, at all events, the earliest king whose tomb has as yet been found in this spot. His son Seti I, then his grandson Ramses II, came hither to rest beside him. The Ramessid pharaohs followed one after the other. Hurrah may perhaps have been the last of the series. These crowded catacombs caused the place to be called the Valley of the Tombs of the Kings, a name which it retains to this day. These tombs are not complete. Each had its chapel, but those chapels stood far away in the plain, at Gurna, at the Ramesseum, at Medinet Habu, and they have already been described. The Theban rock like the Memphite pyramid, contained only the passages and the sepulchral chamber. During the daytime, the pure soul was in no serious danger, but in the evening, when the eternal waters which flow along the vaulted heavens fall in vast cascades down the west and are engulfed in the bowels of the earth, the soul follows the bark of the sun and its escort of luminary gods into a lower world bristling with ambuscades and perils. For 12 hours, the divine squadron defiles through long and gloomy corridors, where numerous genii, some hostile, some friendly, now struggle to bar the way, and now aid it in surmounting the difficulties of the journey. Great doors, each guarded by a gigantic serpent, were stationed at intervals, and led to an immense hall full of flame and fire, peopled by hideous monsters and executioners whose office it was to torture the damned. Then came more dark and narrow passages, more blind gropings in the gloom, more strife with malevolent genii, and again the joyful welcoming of the propitious gods. At midnight began the upward journey towards the eastern regions of the world, and in the morning, having reached the confines of the land of darkness, the sun emerged from the east to light another day. The tombs of the kings were constructed upon the model of the world at night. They had their passages, their doors, their vaulted halls, which plunged down into the depths of the mountain. Their positions in the valley were determined by no consideration of dynasty or succession. Each king attacked the rock at any point where he might hope to find a suitable bed of stone, and this was done with so little regard for his predecessors that the workmen were sometimes obliged to change the direction of the excavation in order not to invade a neighboring catacomb. The designer's plan was a mere sketch, to be modified when necessary, and which was by no means intended to be strictly carried out. Hence the plan and measurement of the actual tomb of Ramses IV, figure 156, differ in the outline of the sides and in the general arrangement from the plan of that same tomb which is preserved on a papyrus in the Turin Museum, figure 153. Nothing, however, could be more simple than the ordinary distribution of the parts. A square door, very sparingly ornamented, opened upon a passage leading to a chamber of more or less extent. From the further end of this chamber opened a second passage, leading to a second chamber, and thence sometimes to more chambers, the last of which contained the sarcophagus. In some tombs, the whole excavation is carried down a gently inclined plane, broken perhaps by only 1 or 2 low steps between the entrance and the end. In others, the various parts follow each other at lower and lower levels. In the catacomb of Seti I, figure 158, a long and narrow flight of stairs and a sloping corridor, A, lead to a little antechamber and 2 halls, B, supported on pillars. A second staircase, C, leads through a second antechamber to another pillared hall, D, which was the hiding place of the sarcophagus. The tomb did not end here. A third staircase, E, opening from the end of the principal hall, was in progress, and would no doubt have led to more halls and chambers, had not the work been stopped by the death of the king. If we go from catacomb to catacomb, we do not find many variations from this plan. The entrance passage in the tomb of Ramses III is flanked by 8 small lateral chambers. In almost every other instance, the lesser or greater length of the passages and the degree of finish given to the wall paintings constitute the only differences between one tomb and another. The smallest of these catacombs comes to an end at 53 feet from the entrance. That of Seti I, which is the longest, descends to a distance of 470 feet and there remains unfinished. The same devices to which the pyramid builders had recourse in order to mislead the spoiler were adopted by the engineers of the Theban catacombs. False shafts were sunk which led to nothing, and walls sculptured and painted were built across the passages. When the burial was over, the entrance was filled up with blocks of rock, and the natural slope of the mountainside was restored as skillfully as might be. The most complete type of this class of catacomb is that left to us by Seti I. Figures and hieroglyphs alike are models of pure design and elegant execution. The tomb of Ramses III already points to decadence. It is for the most part roughly painted. Yellow is freely laid on, and the raw tones of the reds and blues are suggestive of the early daubs of our childhood. Mediocrity ere long reigned supreme, the outlines becoming more feeble, the color more and more glaring, till the latest tombs are but caricatures of those of Seti I and Ramses III. The decoration is always the same, and is based on the same principles as the decoration of the pyramids. At Thebes, as at Memphis, the intention was to secure to the double the free enjoyment of his new abode, and to usher the soul into the company of the gods of the solar cycle and the Osirian cycle, as well as to guide it through the labyrinth of the infernal regions. But the Theban priests exercised their ingenuity to bring before the eyes of the deceased all that which the Memphites consigned to his memory by means of writing, thus enabling him to see what he had formerly been obliged to read upon the walls of his tomb. Where the texts of the Pyramid of Unis relate how Unis, being identified with the sun, navigates the celestial waters or enters the fields of Alu, the pictured walls of the tomb of Seti I show Seti sailing in the solar bark, while a side chamber in the tomb of Ramses III shows Ramses III in the fields of Alu, figure 159. Where the walls of the Pyramid of Unis give the prayers recited over the mummy to open his mouth, to restore the use of his limbs, to clothe, to perfume, to feed him, the walls of Seti's catacomb contain representations of the actual mummy, of the Ka statues which are the supports of his double, and of the priests who open their mouths, who clothe them, perfume them, and offer them the various meats and drinks of the funeral feast. The ceilings of the pyramid chamber were sprinkled over with stars to resemble the face of the heavens, but there was nothing to instruct the soul as to the names of those heavenly bodies. On the ceilings of some of the Theban catacombs, we not only find the constellations depicted, each with its personified image, but astronomical tables giving the aspect of the heavens fortnight by fortnight throughout the months of the Egyptian year, so that the soul had but to lift its eyes and see in what part of the firmament its course lay, night after night. Taken as a series, These tableaux form an illustrated narrative of the travels of the sun and the soul throughout the 24 hours of the day and night. Each hour is represented, as also the domain of each hour, with its circumscribed boundary, the door of which is guarded by a huge serpent. These serpents have their various names, as Fireface, Flaming Eye, Evil Eye, etc. The fate of souls was decided in the third hour of the day. They were weighed by the god Thoth, who consigned them to their future abode according to the verdict of the scales. The sinful soul was handed over to the cynocephalous ape assessors of the infernal tribunal, who hunted and scourged it, after first changing it into a sow or some other impure animal. The righteous soul, on the contrary, passed in the 5th hour into the company of his fellows, whose task it was to cultivate the fields of Alu and reap the corn of the celestial harvest, after which they took their pleasure under the guardianship of the good genie. After the 5th hour, the heavenly ocean became a vast battlefield. The gods of light pursued, captured, and bound the serpent Apapi, and at the 12th hour they strangled him, but this triumph was not of long duration. Scarcely had the sun achieved this victory, when his bark was borne by the tide into the realm of the night hours, and from that moment he was assailed, like Virgil and Dante at the gates of hell, by frightful sounds and clamorings. Each circle had its voice, not to be confounded with the voices of other circles. Here the sound was as an immense humming of wasps. Yonder it was as the lamentations of women for their husbands, and the howling of she-beasts for their mates. Elsewhere it was as the rolling of the thunder. The sarcophagus, as well as the walls, was covered with these scenes of joyous or sinister import. It was generally of red or black granite. As it was put in hand last of all, it frequently happened that the sculptors had not time to finish it. When finished, however, the scenes and texts with which it was covered contained an epitome of the whole catacomb. Thus, lying in his sarcophagus, the dead man found his future destinies depicted thereon, and learned to understand the blessedness of the gods. The tombs of private persons were not often so elaborately decorated. 2 tombs of the period of the 26th dynasty, that of Petamenoph at Thebes and that of Bakenref at Memphis, compete in this respect, however, with the royal catacombs. Their walls are not only sculptured with the text, more or less complete, of the Book of the Dead, but also with long extracts from the Book of the Opening of the Mouth and the religious formulae found in the pyramids. And with that reminder that striving for a higher class is hardly a new phenomenon, I think we'll end this evening's reading from a Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt, which continues to impress me with its detailed breakdown of monuments that have been famous for thousands of years. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the many, many illustrations and photographs, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, as several of you did with this book, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.